Some relationship patterns remain hidden until the emotional cost becomes too heavy to ignore, and one of the most common is the dynamic between an empath and an avoidant partner. Empaths are naturally sensitive and deeply perceptive, often picking up on emotional cues that others miss. They tend to offer patience, understanding, and care even when it isn't consistently returned, especially toward people who keep them at a distance. Avoidant partners, meanwhile, often struggle with emotional closeness. They may want connection, but the vulnerability it requires feels overwhelming, so they maintain space as a form of self-protection. This creates a cycle where the empath continues to invest, hoping consistency and love will eventually create safety, while the avoidant remains partially engaged but never fully available. Over time, this imbalance becomes normal inside the relationship, even though it slowly reshapes both people's emotional experience and expectations of love. Empaths usually respond to emotional withdrawal by leaning in rather than pulling away. Instead of seeing distance as disinterest, they often interpret it as fear, stress, or unresolved emotional struggle in the other person. This leads them to offer even more reassurance, patience, and emotional support, trying to stabilize the connection through understanding. In many cases, they become the emotional grounding force in the relationship, the one who repairs after conflict, softens tension, and keeps communication alive, even when they feel unseen. They genuinely believe that consistent care can help the avoidant partner feel safe enough to open up over time. But in doing so, they often begin reshaping themselves to maintain the bond, slowly normalizing the idea that their own emotional needs should be minimized in order to keep the connection intact. As this pattern continues, it gradually wears down the empath in ways that are not always obvious from the outside. They may still appear patient and emotionally steady, but internally they are carrying the weight of repeated disconnection, unmet needs, and constant self-restraint. Every moment of silence, every avoided conversation, and every dismissed emotional signal adds up over time. Because the empath rarely reacts with immediate anger or withdrawal, the exhaustion builds quietly until it reaches a limit. At that point, something shifts in their perception. They begin to see the relationship not as something that is slowly improving, but as something that repeatedly cycles through the same imbalance. What once felt like hope starts to feel like repetition without real change, and emotional investment no longer feels meaningful in the same way. When that clarity fully settles in, the empath's shift is usually calm rather than dramatic. Instead of reacting outwardly, they begin to pull their energy back inward as a form of self-preservation. The effort they once used to bridge emotional distance starts to fade, not out of revenge, but out of understanding what has actually been happening all along. To the avoidant partner, this withdrawal can feel sudden, but it is actually the result of a long internal process of recognition. The empath realizes that love alone cannot compensate for emotional absence, and that a healthy connection cannot exist where only one person is consistently holding the weight of it. That shift you're describing is really the turning point of the entire dynamic. It often feels like nothing changed, but in reality, everything changes internally for the empath long before anything becomes visible on the surface. When emotional effort stops producing connection, it stops feeling like love in motion and starts feeling like repetition without return. Even someone deeply empathetic and highly patient eventually reaches a point where they can clearly see that understanding alone isn't repairing the imbalance. At that stage, the empath doesn't become cold or indifferent in a dramatic way. Instead, their energy simply stops expanding outward in the same direction. What used to be automatic care, checking in, explaining, softening misunderstandings, slowly turns into restraint, then into observation, and finally into withdrawal of emotional investment. Avoidant individuals often don't fully recognize the depth of their own fear around intimacy, even though it consistently shapes how they move in relationships. Closeness can feel threatening because it activates old associations with loss of control, emotional exposure, or eventual pain. So instead of moving fully into connection, they tend to regulate distance, staying present enough to maintain the bond, but distant enough to avoid vulnerability. When they meet an empath, this balance feels especially manageable at first. The empath's consistency, patience, and emotional generosity create a sense of safety that feels almost relieving. It can seem like the relationship finally works without requiring too much emotional exposure from them. But over time, that stability becomes deceptive because it is not mutual stability. It is largely carried by one side. What the avoidant often misreads is the sustainability of that emotional structure. Because the empath continues showing up, explaining, and adapting, it can create the impression that the connection is secure regardless of effort. But each moment of emotional dismissal, each avoided conversation, and each instance where the empath's needs are minimized becomes part of an internal accumulation the avoidant doesn't directly see. The empath is not forgetting these moments. They are processing them, carrying them, and slowly reorganizing their understanding of the relationship around them. On the outside, everything may look stable, but internally, the foundation is weakening because emotional reciprocity is not being met. Eventually, what once felt like patience begins to turn into depletion, and what once felt like understanding begins to feel like self-erasure. The most misunderstood moment in this dynamic is the silence that follows. When the empath stops reaching, it can initially feel like relief to the avoidant, even like things have improved because pressure seems to disappear. But that silence is not empty, and it is not passive. It reflects a complete internal shift where effort is no longer being directed toward maintaining something one-sided. The empath is no longer operating from hope or anticipation of change, but from clarity about what has actually been happening over time. That clarity doesn't come from a single event, but from accumulated emotional experiences that eventually reach a point of no longer being rationalized away. And when that point is reached, the change is not dramatic but decisive. The empath redirects their emotional energy inward, not as punishment, but as self-correction. What the avoidant often realizes too late is that the connection didn't collapse suddenly. It stopped being emotionally sustained long before anything visibly ended. That shift is really where the entire structure of the relationship changes at its core. It often feels sudden from the outside, especially to the avoidant partner, but internally it's been a long process of depletion followed by clarity. The empath doesn't stop caring in an instant. What actually happens is that the effort to interpret confusion, soften emotional distance, and maintain connection through patience slowly loses meaning. At some point, trying to figure it out stops feeling like love and starts feeling like self-abandonment. That's when the decision forms quietly, not as a reaction to one moment, but as the result of many unbalanced moments that were never fully repaired. Avoidant behavior is often rooted in a learned association between emotional closeness and internal discomfort. So instead of fully entering vulnerability, there's a tendency to regulate intimacy through distance, pulling back when things feel too exposed. In the presence of an empath, this can initially feel manageable or even ideal. The empath absorbs emotional tension, fills silence with understanding, and stabilizes what otherwise might feel overwhelming. It can create a sense of connection without demanding equal emotional exposure, but the cost of that imbalance is not immediately visible to the avoidant, because the empath is the one silently carrying the emotional weight of maintaining closeness. Over time, though, that structure becomes unsustainable. the empath begins to register patterns rather than isolated incidents, moments of withdrawal, lack of responsiveness, emotional minimization, or unreciprocated effort. Even if they continue to show patience externally, internally something is changing. They are no longer reorganizing their behavior around the relationship in the same way. The emotional labor that once felt like devotion starts to feel like repetition without return. And when that realization settles in fully, the empath's response is not dramatic escalation, but reduction, less explaining, less reaching, less emotional overextension. That reduction is what creates the real rupture, even if it looks like silence. From the avoidant perspective, it can initially be misread as space or temporary distance, because that is what they are accustomed to. But this is fundamentally different. It is not space created to invite reconnection. It is withdrawal based on acceptance that connection, in its needed form, has not been met. The empath is no longer trying to bridge the gap. They are no longer translating emotional distance into something hopeful. They have already moved past interpretation into conclusion, and that is why the absence feels so different. It is not just the loss of attention or communication. It is the loss of emotional availability that once made the entire dynamic functional. The empath was often the stabilizing presence, the one who maintained continuity through care, patience, and repair. When that presence is no longer offered, the avoidant is left with a version of connection that cannot be sustained unilaterally. What remains is the very emotional space they were avoiding engaging with directly. The most significant misunderstanding in this dynamic is assuming the empath leaves to create impact. In reality, they leave because impact has already been felt internally for a long time. The decision is not about changing the avoidant's behavior. It is about ending their own participation in a cycle that no longer aligns with their emotional truth. That's why attempts to pull them back often fail at that stage. The empath is no longer operating from hope or emotional negotiation. They are operating from closure. And once that closure is reached, the dynamic cannot be restarted in its previous form. The empath doesn't become unavailable out of strategy, but out of completion. They stop investing in potential and start responding to reality as it has consistently shown itself. That is what makes the shift irreversible. Not anger, not punishment, but the quiet end of emotional overextension in a place where it was never being met equally. Not out of anger or the desire to hurt someone back, but as a form of self-repair. That is what ultimately defines a fed-up empath. They reach a point where they are no longer willing to pour endless emotional energy into a connection that only meets them halfway. Instead of continuing to overextend themselves for the sake of keeping something alive, they redirect that same depth inward. The shift is not loud or dramatic, but it is final in its own way. They stop abandoning themselves to maintain access to someone who could not fully meet them. In doing so, they begin to understand that their empathy was never the issue, it was only misplaced. When it is not reciprocated, it becomes exhaustion, but when it is matched, it becomes something steady and life-giving. So, if you identify as the empath, the one who stayed too long and hoped things would eventually change, the truth is, your capacity to feel deeply was never your weakness. It only felt like a burden in the wrong environment. In the right connection, that same depth becomes grounding rather than draining. And if you identify more with avoidance, understand that emotional safety is not built through distance, but through presence and consistency. Eventually, even the most patient heart stops returning to one-sided effort. Not because it stops loving, but because it finally starts valuing itself equally. And when that happens, silence is no longer a strategy, it is closure. In the end, what this dynamic really reveals is not a battle between two people, but a mismatch in emotional availability, timing, and capacity. The empath isn't too much, and the avoidant isn't necessarily too little as a person. But together, without awareness and mutual effort, they often fall into a pattern where one person overgives while the other keeps retreating. And over time, that imbalance stops feeling like a phase and starts feeling like the entire relationship. The empath slowly learns that love without reciprocity becomes self-erasure, not because they are weak, but because they are consistent, attentive, and deeply invested. That consistency is what keeps them trying far longer than is healthy, because they don't give up easily on people they see potential in. The turning point always comes quietly. It is not a dramatic exit, not an emotional explosion, not a moment of revenge. It is the moment the empath stops negotiating with themselves about what they deserve. They stop explaining away distance, stop rewriting inconsistency into misunderstanding, and stop translating emotional absence into hidden love. That clarity doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds through exhaustion, reflection, and repeated disappointment that can no longer be rationalized. And when it finally settles, the shift is internal long before it becomes visible. They begin to detach not out of anger, but out of truth, out of the recognition that they have been carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be carried alone. For the avoidant, this change often arrives too late to be understood in real time, because what they were used to was a dynamic where distance never fully cost them connection. The empath was always there, bridging the gap, softening silence, and maintaining emotional continuity. So when that presence disappears, it doesn't just feel like loss of communication, it feels like loss of emotional structure. The stability they may have unconsciously depended on is suddenly gone, and what remains is the very space they spent years avoiding. But by then, the empath is no longer in the same emotional position. They are no longer reaching, explaining, or trying to rebuild what repeatedly broke without repair. What makes this shift irreversible is that the empath doesn't leave from a place of emotional emptiness, but from emotional clarity. They don't stop loving because they are incapable of love. They stop overgiving because they finally understand that love alone cannot sustain a relationship that lacks mutual presence. That realization changes everything. It redefines what they are willing to accept, what they are willing to tolerate, and what they are no longer willing to confuse with connection. And once that internal boundary is formed, it does not reopen easily, because it is built from experience rather than impulse. In that sense, the empath's departure is not an ending rooted in pain, but an ending rooted in understanding. It is the moment they choose alignment over attachment, peace over pursuit, and self-respect over emotional uncertainty. And while it may feel like loss to the avoidant and like release to the empath, it is ultimately a correction of imbalance that was never sustainable in its original form. What remains afterward is not bitterness, but distance that finally makes room for clarity on both sides.